Today we are going to continue on in Genesis. We're going to start in Genesis 40. And for this, so where we've kind of jumped around a little bit, in the first 39 chapters, we're actually going to kind of go through kind of in order, chronologically, if you will, and kind of talk about some of the things as we've been doing, some of the deals. I will say that it will get a little R-rated later on again, as sometimes it will, but again, we're all adults. And so, all right, so we get to Genesis 40, right? And you have the cupbearer and the baker. So what is that all about, right? So note that a cupbearer, like literally they had the cup, that they would bring the drink to the king, and the baker was in charge of the food. And so these people had a very important job, right? This is, we think of the person that just gives the cup, but these people literally had the life of the king in their hands, right? They would also be responsible for vetting other people who, might work. So like, obviously the baker, he's not going to do all the cooking. There'll be other people there. So he would have to vet those people and all of that. So again, important job. There are a number of reasons why the baker and the cupbearer might be imprisoned. It could go from, your highest, of course, would be, that they were accused of plotting to kill the king or the pharaoh. But it could have been as little as they served him food that he didn't like, or maybe he got sick after eating a meal. So that would be, that's something that would get you in prison, right? Because, kings and pharaohs and such, they could be a little fickle. And so it could have been something like that. The text doesn't tell us exactly what they did. And so, so we could only speculate, which, is oftentimes not very useful. What does it mean to be hung on a tree, right? Depending on the translation you have at Genesis 40:19. The ESV, again, which is a little more literal, it says, in 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you, right? So some of your translations probably say impale you, right? And so that's good because that's literally what it would be. So the word tala, which is the word that it says hang you, it means to hang up or to attach to, right? So it has a little flexibility in the meaning. And then the word for tree there in Hebrew is ayetz. And that can mean tree, timber, wood, or stick, right? So you have a lot of a variation in meaning, what we call a semantic domain, right? There's several meanings that you could have. And so we know from the context that what would have happened is he would have been killed, and then he would have been impaled. It says that he would be beheaded. And so they would behead him. They would impale him on a stake, and then they would probably impale his head on a stake as well. And the point of that is to tell people that might be coming to the city, these people don't play around, right? So don't come in here, fooling around and do anything crazy because they will kill you to death, right? And this always gets me when we talk about like foreign countries and stuff, right? When people go into foreign countries and they do stupid stuff that like they have severe punishments, or like you don't want to end up in a Tijuana jail or whatever, right? It reminds me of the kid who went to Singapore several years back, and he sprayed graffiti, right? And you remember what they did to him? They caned him. I think his sentence was like 300 lashes with the cane, but he got off light, and I think they gave him like 50 canings or something. And so, not okay, right? In other words, but listen, if you go into a place like that and you know that their judicial system is a little more severe than ours, you generally would tend not to do that. But sometimes in our youth we make interesting decisions. All right, the interpretation of dreams. Of course, the interpretations of dreams is important here. In chapters 40 and 41, you have the interpretations of the cupbearer and the baker, and then, of course, he goes to the Pharaoh. So note that dreams were seen to be from the divine realm. So when you had a dream, that dream was coming from a God. So there was a reason that you had a dream. I always am fascinated to know people that don't remember any of their dreams, right? So like I have vivid dreams all the time. And sometimes it's like I work all night long doing whatever crazy things in my dream, and I wake up the next morning, I'm like, oh, I worked all night. And so it's like, I didn't really, you wake up tired, I need to take a nap after I wake up, which is pretty usual anyway. They come from the divine realm. They're there for a reason, right? They were understood to contain symbols and meanings that needed to be interpreted by a specialist. So the God communicated the dream to the dreamer, but then the specialist came in, and then the God would present the meaning to the specialist. And the way that they found that meaning is that they would go through what we call today dream books. And particularly the Babylonians and the Egyptians, they had what's called dream books. So the experts would go to the dream books. They would look in there, as it says here in Genesis 41:8. It says magicians and wise men in Egypt, right? So they're experts in dreams. They can read the dream books, right? It's kind of like when you call tech support at a company. Basically, those people are just better at Google than you are because they can figure it out. You can figure out pretty well what's going on if you know how to use Google well. And so that's kind of them. They knew how to read the dream books. They knew how to interpret that based on the dream books. One could potentially reverse what was going to happen. So, if the dream's telling you something and they're like, okay, well, this is what the interpretation is. Well, it would be possible that you could reverse that depending on what it was and all of that. And then double dreams are well known in the ancient world, and double dreams did make it more definitive that thing was going to happen, which is what you get with the Pharaoh. Note that Joseph acknowledges that the interpretation is up to God in Genesis 48 and 41:16. So he goes directly to the source, right? He goes to God and he's like, okay, which is, again, that's what everybody else believed as well, right? They believed that the dreams came from God, and so Joseph, he goes to God and he's like, all right, the God of Israel, of course, or ultimately the God of Israel. And note that since interpretations came from God, and Joseph is correct in his interpretation, then that is confirmation for Joseph that God is with him, right? Because he says, okay, only God interprets dreams, which is correct. And then he says, okay, well, this is the interpretation that I believe I have gotten from God. And then that interpretation ends up true. Then Joseph knows, and Pharaoh knows that God is indeed with him. However, Joseph's interpretation, though given by God, still follows the methods used by his contemporaries. So God often uses, again, the thinking of the day and everything to make things happen. For instance, the dream books of Mesopotamia included lists of particular symbols and their meanings, including divisions of objects in the dream showing how much time will pass before an event happens. So for instance, Joseph predicts the time of the cupbearer's dream is going to be in 3 days, based on the 3 divisions of the grapevine. So again, normally you would open a book and you would say, okay, and you would look through and you would see about divisions, and you say, okay, well, if there are specific divisions of certain items, oh, that means it's going to be that many days. And you're like, oh, okay. It's like a decoder ring, if you will. Also, you would have items with specific meanings, such as goblets and things carried on the head, strangely enough. Like you can open an ancient Mesopotamian dream book and you can read about those specific things. So for instance, and this doesn't have anything to do with this, but if you read a Mesopotamian dream book, it says that a full goblet means that you're going to have many offspring, right? And so if you dream about a full goblet, somebody hands you a full goblet, then that equals you're going to be, you're going to be a father many times. All right, moving to Genesis 41. And Joseph's plan, right? So Joseph comes in. Note that Joseph doesn't just interpret the dream. He also presents a plan to mitigate the 7 years of famine. And so he doesn't just come in with the entire, like, this is what it means, stinks for you, right? He's like, okay, this is what you should do, which Pharaoh appreciates. And let me just say that Joseph would have made a fantastic U.S. politician. So let me. It gets kind of complicated when you read his plan, right? So let me spell out the plan for you. His plan is to tax everybody an extra 20%. So you've got fields and such, and so you take 20% of what you grew, you take that, and then you give it to the state, all right? And then the state will hold that, right? And they'll keep that so that when the famine comes, we have excess, right? And that seems logical. Of course, that's logical. However, when the famine hits, he then charges those same people for the grain and stuff. So there's double taxation, right? So they're getting taxed because they have to give it to the government, and then they're taxed when it comes back to them for their food. And then, when they can no longer pay for their food, he then takes the land for the government, for Egypt, and then allows them to work on their land for the government, right? And so again, and I joke about it, obviously, but this still saved the people, right? I mean, it saved their lives. And so slavery in the ancient world, which was usually like what we would think of as, in the early Americas, it's not like what we think of as, African transatlantic slave trade. It's not that. It's more, I can't feed myself, so therefore I sell myself into slavery so that at least I can eat and have a place to sleep. And so this is basically what that is. They are basically selling themselves into slavery, ultimately is what it works out to. And that happened throughout the ancient world. Regardless of how you look at it, and it does seem pretty shrewd, it did save their lives. And that would have been a fairly normal thing. Otherwise, they would have just died. And so if Joseph had not come up with this plan, then, it would have been bad. So note then, of course, like Joseph is then promoted to a position of authority, right? Because it's like, well, that's a spectacular plan, bless you. Note that the king says at 4138 that Joseph possesses the Ruah Elohim, right? Which you all know what that means. I'm just kidding. Ruah means spirit. Elohim means God, right? That's all that is. But remember, if you will, back in some previous lessons, I told you that Elohim is actually a plural noun. And it means gods generally, but when it refers to Yahweh as Elohim, it means God, right? But it is a plural noun. So when Pharaoh says that, he is likely saying that Joseph has the spirit of the gods, right? Because for them, it's fine to worship Joseph's God, right? Like Joseph's God is helping us out, whoever that is, right? And it's Yahweh. Yahweh is his personal name. And so Yahweh is doing us a favor right now. Good job, Yahweh. They didn't look at it like we would today. Like if you went to Afghanistan and something good happened to you, you wouldn't, as a Christian, assuming obviously you're all Christians here, you wouldn't then worship Allah and say, well, thank you, Allah, since I'm in Afghanistan, I appreciate you helping me out, right? You wouldn't do that. In the ancient world, the more the merrier, right? It wasn't exclusive, except the Jewish people were supposed to be exclusive, but everybody else was not. And so it was the more the merrier. I always use the example. So like for us, we're in Morris, here in Morris, Alabama. And so we worship the God of Morris, right? And then you go to Gardendale. I need to travel to Gardendale. Well, they have the God of Gardendale. And so if I need to travel to Gardendale, well, I'm going to go ahead and sacrifice to the God of Gardendale to make sure that I have a good trip there, make sure everything's okay. If I'm coming from, let's say I'm coming from Hayden, I'm going to worship the God of Hayden, the God of Warrior, the God of Kimberly, the God of Morris, and the God of Gardendale, right? Because I want to make sure everybody's on board with this, that, hey, I'm coming through, and I need all the gods, to have favor with all the gods. That would have been a normal thing. So here, it wouldn't be so outrageous for Pharaoh to accept that Joseph's God helped them out, but in general, he's probably talking about the gods like as a whole. Either way, the king sees that Joseph's ability to interpret dreams, or his translations of these dreams, they are divinely inspired. And they are, right? So we know that they are. They came from Yahweh. So Joseph is then given a signet ring. Okay, so a signet ring had the king's seal on it, and it was used to impress the king's seal into wax for documents. So I need to send a letter to somewhere else. I'm going to have a scribe write that letter out for me, and then they're going to roll that thing up. We're going to take and melt some wax. We're going to put it right there where it overlaps. Put the wax on there. I take my seal, I put it on there, and it presses it down, and it has the picture of my seal in it, which would have my name on it and some sort of image. And then I send that document. When the receiver gets that document, he looks at it and he says, oh, okay, this is from the Pharaoh or whoever, because it's got his seal on it. And so that would be a way to make sure of the security of the document that you're receiving. The robes and the chain that he gets, they signify his position. So people seeing him would know his position. And John Walton, he compares the chariots to limousines and the men going before him as the Secret Service, right? Which is pretty much exactly what it would be.
And Joseph looked like Mr. T.
Yeah, maybe, yes. Maybe he looked like Mr. T. Yes. Never thought of it like that, but every time I read it from this point on, I will. And I'm sure he pities the fool that does not pay their 20% extra taxes. So, a chariot would be a special thing. And so you'd get in a chariot, you'd be carried around, and people would, they would be like, oh, a fancy person's coming, right? Because, if you're in a chariot, you're fancy. It is unclear what official position Joseph had, but it was normal for several positions of second in command to Pharaoh or to the king to be given out. He clearly had a position of prominence, right? But think of it like a corporation. I know, for instance, because my wife used to work on a Regions account, and at Regions Bank, they have the president of the bank or of the company or whatever. But then they have the vice president of this, they have the vice president of that, and the vice president of another thing. So they have all of these vice presidents, right? Whereas we think in terms of the government, we think, well, you have a president, you have a vice president, and then you go down from there. Well, they had many vice presidents, right? And of course, all of those are high paid positions, and they're positions of authority, but you're not just like one vice president. So to say that Joseph is second in command to Pharaoh, oftentimes we will look and we'll say, well, okay, that seems to specify, like we should be able to figure that out. Like if he's second in command to Pharaoh, like what does that mean? And there are a few positions that scholars will say, well, he's probably this or he's probably that. For instance, it seems as though Pharaoh puts him over his household first, right? And then later he puts him over, and I forget the official name for it, but it's like he's over granaries and whatever else, which would be that position.
Agriculture.
Right. And so he's over all of that and taking care of all that stuff. So again, that's why scholars will try to nail down exactly what the position is, because we can't really know. You think, well, it says second in command. That must mean he's the vice president. Well, it didn't really work that way. Joseph is assimilated into Egyptian culture. When he is put in his high position, they assimilate him in some ways. So he is shaven. Probably both his head and his beard would be shaven. He is given an Egyptian name, Zaphanath Paneah, right, which is a fancy name. I'm thinking, if only I could have another kid, I would name them Zaphanath Paneah. So if any of you are going to have children, I'm just saying that, that's a possibility. The meaning of this name is uncertain, but the most popular translations are God speaks and he lives, or the God has said he will live. But we don't know for sure. And note that usually in the Old Testament, when you have an important name, it tells you what it means. It'll say, because he did this, that, or the other thing, he named him whatever, right? And so that tells you right there, oh, that's what that name must mean, because it says, because he did this, that's what his name is. Or he named him this because of this. Well, that means the name means whatever this is, right? So it's close together. So the fact that the narrator does not tell you what the name means that the name doesn't mean anything that's important to the story. The importance to the story is that he gets an Egyptian name, right? So they change his name to an Egyptian name. Notice that he is given as his wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. And we do know about On. On was a city known for the worship of Ra, the sun god. The priests of On were one of the most influential priestly families from about 1600 BC until 1100 BC. So that's a long time. Like, they're very influential. And so the Egyptians would have considered a great honor for this guy to marry into that family. And so they would have accepted him at that point because he's an outsider, right? But once he marries into this famous family, Egyptian family, then at that point, he would be accepted. Notice, and I'd prefer to do it later, but just every time I do this, it's like my throat starts going, So later on, when we get to Daniel, we'll talk a little bit more about this. But note, there are many parallels that Daniel has with Joseph, because of course Daniel is later. And note that Daniel is also, he works for the Babylonian government, and then he works for the Persian government, and he is also assimilated, right? Assimilation does not mean that they give up their religion, right? It doesn't mean that they stop worshiping Yahweh. It just means that they go fairly far to be assimilated into that empire, so that they're accepted as a part of it. So Daniel and his friends, for example, they learn the literature. They're supposed to eat the food, but then they don't, and then that works out well. So there's lots going on with that, but it would be advantageous, again, to be part of. But just because they become a part of it, particularly clearly in the Daniel story and his friends, clearly they do not give up their religion and their worship of Yahweh, the one true God. And they go through many trials and tribulations to make that clear, right, that they're not going to do that. Notice that the names of Joseph's sons reflect his life thus far. He names both of his children with Hebrew names. Okay, so he doesn't name them with Egyptian names. He names them Hebrew names. And that tells you that he has not forgotten his father's house. Manasseh, his first son, means one who causes to forget. And at Genesis 41:51, it says, Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. And so the point there is that clearly it still bothers him, all of the things that have happened. Now he's got this great position, and he's over important things in Egypt, and he's doing well. But clearly, his family did him wrong, and it's still going to be a little tender. And then he explains that Ephraim means, at 41:52, it says, the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. So he still sees that land. That's the land that he was persecuted in. He was sold into slavery, ended up a slave in Egypt, and then many bad things happened to him. Now he gets out of it and he rises again to that position. But again, we can't dismiss, we look at Joseph, and clearly there are several places where it says, Joseph accepted that that God was working through his life and all of those things. But that doesn't mean that it didn't hurt at the time, and that he didn't, that it wasn't, it wasn't raw, right? And so we don't want to take that away. We don't want to say, well, Joseph was so pious that that every time he went through some terrible thing, like his brothers sell him into slavery, and he's like, well, I know this seems bad at first, but God's going to work through this. And then, he gets, accused of sexual assault, and then he's like, well, this is inconvenient, but God's working through this, At the moment, those things are bad, and we don't ever want to take those things away, but he realizes throughout all of that God is indeed working, and so that does make his story more spectacular, but it doesn't mean that it wasn't hard to go through those times. We've all been through hard times. And you're all reading Job right now, right? Because we're a week off, and so we get that when you're going through stuff, you have a lot of questions, and you don't just, most people don't automatically just praise God. I'm going through a trial so that I'll be better on the other side or whatever, right? That's just human nature. Now, would it be ultimately fantastic if we could get to that point? Maybe, but it's hard. All right, so then we get to Genesis 42 through 44 and the family reunion, right, with his brothers. Note that Joseph's dreams are literally fulfilled at this point, right? So remember, he had the dreams that they were bowing down to him and stuff, and technically all of his brothers aren't there. But basically his dreams are fulfilled at this point. And so they do come in, and they end up bowing down to him to get food and everything. The text says at Genesis 42, 8 through 9, and Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. And Joseph remembered the dreams that he had dreamed of them, and he said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land." So note that he remembers it. He would realize at this point that his dreams are coming true. But he would also remember that it's the dreams that were the source of his trials with his brothers in the first place, the dreams and the coat, right? And so it would be hard to go through that. It's kind of like the other thing. It's like I was right. Like he does it just automatic. Wow, it's my brothers, like, God, these are the people who sold me into slavery. Like, what do I do now? So Joseph's treatment of his brothers has had mixed reactions from Bible scholars, with Walter Brueggemann going as far as to state he is presented as ruthless, cunning, and vengeful. He is prepared to return to his brothers some of the grief caused him. He has forgotten nothing. There is nothing noble about him. There is no hint that he has any awareness of a larger vocation. Right? And then he goes on to say, but he is not a man without passion. His passion is not for his brothers, not for the well-being of his family, not even for his father. His overriding passion is for Benjamin. He wants to know if Benjamin is alive, and he wants to see him. That yearning sets Joseph on a collision course with his father, who cannot bear to release the beloved son of his old age. The hungry father wants to keep Benjamin. The ruling son wants to see him. Okay, now that's a pretty harsh interpretation of what's going on here. And note that Walter Brueggemann is a scholar among Bible scholars, but he at least, at the very least, he goes too far with this. And at worst, he just misreads the whole thing. Surely Joseph is still raw about what happened, and it is certainly plausible that he takes some pleasure in messing around with his brothers, who did, of course, sell him into slavery. But the text shows in several places that he understood that God was in control of his circumstances and the things that he was going through. So by this point, he gets there, and it seems like he's at least coming to that realization. I certainly don't think he's, it's as severe as Walter Brueggemann says. And again, he does mess with them. But again, I'm going to appeal to John Walton, who sees Joseph's actions toward his brothers as a test to see if they have reformed their ways, which, in all fairness, and I think most of us read it that way, that's the way I've always read it. It doesn't come across to me as he's vindictive in any way. He might be jerking them around a little bit, but it doesn't come across as the vindictiveness as what Brueggemann will say. Joseph treats his brothers harshly, and just for the record, much of this, John Walton makes these connections, and so I'm just going to go ahead and cite that most of these connections here are his. Joseph treats his brothers harshly as they had treated him, as they appealed to their honesty, right? So they're appealing to their honesty. They're like, we are honest men. And, Joseph's like, really? Like, can you not think of anything you've ever done that might be construed as dishonest? Like, really? Yeah, right? So Joseph imprisons them as he was imprisoned in a cistern and then in Egypt, right? So he does that. He keeps Simeon, which tests the brothers as to whether they will take the opportunity to again abandon one of their brothers, right? And to your question that you wanted answered, unfortunately I'm not going to be able to answer your question well. It does not say why they abandoned Simeon, right? But it could be speculated that Simeon would be the most likely to be left behind without too much concern from the others. So for whatever reason, Joseph was with them at, 13 years ago, or however long it's been. And so he knows his brothers. And so maybe he's like, well, Simeon, they don't like him anyway. So they give him the opportunity. It could also be that Joseph somehow considers him most responsible for his plight, right? So for whatever reason, it doesn't say it. None of this is said in the text, right? So you just have to, kind of speculate, right? And so, but we don't know. Ultimately, the answer is, who knows? He asked for Benjamin to be brought, which will afford him the opportunity to see if they are treating their younger brother, Rachel's other son, the way they treated him. And that's what the setup is. It's to get Benjamin here so he can test them, because he knows that Benjamin received special treatment. He's going to give him even more special treatment, and he's going to make it easy for the brothers to leave him behind when he puts the silver goblet or cup or whatever, it's way later, silver cup, okay, in his bag. He sets it all perfectly out for them to make them go, yeah, well, I mean, he took the cup, so we don't like him because, Dad likes him a lot, and then this crazy guy from Egypt, he's giving him all this extra stuff, so let's just leave him, right? That's the point of all of this. That's the test to see if they'll leave him. He does get some of the answer before they leave, though. It says at 42:21 through 23, then they said to one another, in truth, we are guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we did not listen. This is why this distress has come upon us. And Reuben answered them, did I not tell you not to sin against the boy? But you did not listen. So now there comes a reckoning for his blood. They did not know that Joseph understood them, for there was an interpreter between them. So note that Joseph has an interpreter there to kind of play up the whole thing as though he's just an Egyptian, right? And so that makes it comfortable for them because they can speak freely without him knowing this Egyptian, guy from knowing what they're saying. And he's listening the whole time. He's like, yeah, I know exactly what you're saying. So they will return. Notice these parallels that John Walton brings out. They will return back to their father with silver, but without one of their brothers who is left in Egypt. As they did when they sold Joseph into slavery, they got money for him, and they took that money back, but they did not bring their brother back, right? Note that Judah's leadership in the clan is shown through his convincing of his father to allow them to take Benjamin. And then note when we get to the blessings, Judah is specifically blessed as the one who will be the leader of the family, right? And so this shows part of his leadership, the fact that he's able to convince his father, whereas Reuben is ineffective. Reuben tries to convince father, but father's like, no. Notice again that Joseph dotes on Benjamin during their meal together, as Jacob had doted on Joseph, and how he currently is doting on Benjamin as well. It's to build the whole thing up and make his brothers jealous. Joseph is giving them the opportunity to relieve themselves of another younger brother and son of Rachel who is getting special treatment. The test will show if they will abandon Benjamin out of jealousy as they abandon him. The offer, so note that when they come in and they say, hey, one of you stole the divining cup, they say, if you find that cup in one of our bags, you can kill the person who took it, right? And notice that he says, no, that will be unnecessary. I will simply enslave that person. Because again, that parallels what happened to him. So he is giving them the opportunity to repeat their same mistake. Because they might think, like they did before, killing him, we don't want to kill Benjamin. But slavery, not so bad, right? And so he makes it equal. He makes the comparison as close as he can. Note that the brothers return back. And Judah, who offered up the plan to sell Joseph in the first place, he's the one that said they should sell Joseph. Notice that he offers to sacrifice himself for Benjamin. And so that shows Joseph that they have reformed, they have changed their ways, and they're not the brothers that they were before. And that's the test. That's the point of all the tests. And those parallels are important. All right, Joseph's cup of divination. In Genesis 44, what is that all about? Note that divination was used in Israel from time to time. For instance, the casting of lots is noted in the Old Testament and not spoken of negatively in Leviticus 16:8 and Jonah 1:7. God allows the use of lots because they were universally known and understood. So God allowed their use to reveal his will on occasion in certain circumstances, okay? So what is the casting of lots? So what you do is you get a container, all right, and then you put like I put your wedding ring, and then I put like your necklace, maybe your glasses, I put his watch, and I would put them all in the container, and I would take the cup and I would shake it up and down like this. And whatever popped out of it, that's the person who can tell us what we need to know. That's exactly what happens in the story of Jonah, right? So they're on the boat and they're like, hey, the storm's here. Clearly the gods are angry. Like, we've made some god mad. Somebody needs to tell what they've done. Like, somebody's made a god mad. And Jonah's all like, not me. Actually, he's asleep, right? And they bring him in and they're like, hey, did you do anything? He's like, nope, I didn't do anything. So they cast lots, right? And then, of course, his lot pops out. And they're like, okay, what's going on? And he's like, well, what had happened was, and he explains, and then they know, and then they throw him overboard, right? And so that's to appease the god, which it does do for them, right? And so again, so you say, well, that's weird. Like, why? So why do they get to use divination? And clearly, just for the record, there are places where the Old Testament speaks out. The law speaks out against divination in many places. But at this point, in those points, in those circumstances, God says, you know what? They're going to want to cast lots, and I'm not going to explain it to them at this point. So let's just let them do it, and then let it be done. Note that in the situation with Jonah, specifically, that is going to be pagans who are in charge of casting the lots, right? So they're the ones doing it. So for the God of Israel to be like, okay, listen, pagan worshipers, first of all, this isn't going to work. And he says, I'm not going to do all that. I'm just going to let it work, okay? Let it work. It's still God's will through the casting of the lots. So the interpretation of dreams was also considered a form of divination, which of course you get at least two major stories with Daniel and Joseph. Things that you don't get that are never okay in Israel is astrology and the reading of animal entrails. Those were forms of divination practiced in the ancient Near East, and there's never a time that I can think of that the Old Testament says that it's okay. There are times when they do that, but it's always, negative. It's always like, oh, you shouldn't be doing that. Most likely here, with the divination cup, what you would do with the divination cup is what is known as hydromancy. And what you would do is you would take the cup, you would put water in it, you'd put oil in it, or you'd put like small pebbles, and then those things would do whatever they do, and then that's how you would divine the will of God, right? Now, we don't know that Joseph actually did that. He sits the cup in there and he sends it away. Notice he doesn't consult the dream books to interpret the dreams. He just goes straight to God. So just because he has the divining cup doesn't mean that he's actually using it. And listen, again, there's places where they use, divination in other places, but we don't know that Joseph actually uses it. They would expect an Egyptian to do it. It's something valuable that he could put in the bag that would, make them upset, and so he does that. So it may be that he doesn't use it for actual divination. However, the interesting thing about it, and the irony here, is that he does actually use it for divination, but not in the way that we normally think of. He uses the cup to divine the characters of his brothers, right? But not in a magical sort of way, in a psychological way, if you will, right? He uses a psychological trick to see if they have reformed. And so again, there's no magic involved. It's just basically just a trick to figure out. It's good psychology. All right, Genesis 45 through 47. Note that Genesis 15:13, just for the record, you don't have to go there, I'll read it to you. Genesis 15:13 states, "Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. So note that this sets up that. And so that 400 years is going to be the time period between Genesis and Exodus. So here we are right here at the end of Genesis. We're going to end Genesis in about 1700 and something BC, we're going to end in a pretty good spot, right? Then you start Exodus in a bad spot. The Exodus occurs, and depending on who you ask, is about 1446 BC, right? So there's your 400 years. There's a later date where they bump everything about 200 years. It's fine either way, but it works out to 400 years. So we're leading up to that point. And so we have God's plan coming around to where we get in position there in the land of Goshen so that we can be in Egypt, so that we can ultimately get to the major event in Israelite history, which is the Exodus. Note that the covenant plan is proceeding. Note that all of Joseph's trials and movements from position to position have led to this moment where God has provided for Israel through Joseph's situation. If Joseph hadn't been sold into slavery, imprisoned, met the cupbearer, and put before the king to interpret dreams, then the family could have been lost to the famine. But here they are, and here they will grow into a large group, right? And it's going to get even more like spectacular here in a minute, where you realize kind of how Joseph was able to work that out, which is pretty cool. Egyptians and foreigners, right? So Egyptians were very particular. They did not like foreigners. Note that at Genesis 43:32, it says the text, I'm reading it as though it's a Bible verse. At Genesis 43:32, the text states that Egyptians did not eat with foreigners. Joseph sits separated not because he's a foreigner, obviously, he's an Egyptian, but because of his high position. So you have the lower Egyptians that are part of his, group or whatever. They're eating. You have Joseph, who has a high position, so he eats by himself. And then you have the Israelites who eat by themselves because they can't eat. The Egyptians would not allow them to eat with them. At Genesis 46:31 through 47:6, Joseph tells his brothers to tell the king that they have brought their livestock and that it is their occupation. And so that whole story is weird. It's like, wait a minute, why is he telling them this? And then it says, well, Egyptians, they don't like shepherds. So tell them you're shepherds. And you're like, well, wait a minute. That doesn't make sense. Like you're telling them the wrong thing. It seems that Egyptians did not like nomadic people. So that's people that don't live in cities, right? They go from place to place. And all of the patriarchs, they were nomadic. And so they'll go to place with their livestock. And Egyptians did not trust people who were nomadic. By having them tell Pharaoh that they are shepherds, Joseph is ensuring that they will be separated out from the rest of the Egyptians, right? Because they don't like shepherds. And so they're like, hey, we're shepherds. And they're like, okay, because Pharaoh's going to be like, okay, well, you can stay. But then he's like, I don't know, how should we do this? We'll set you guys off to the land of Goshen, where there were already Semitic people living. And so it was just like, we're going to put them over there to where they don't cause any trouble in the city. This will help keep them from assimilating into Egyptian culture and following their gods. Now, over 400 years, did they eventually follow the gods of Egypt? Very possible, very likely. But as they grow into this large nation, they stay together as Israelites. So you still have a nation of Israel over that 400 years, even if they may or may not worship the gods of the Egyptians. Making clear that they have brought their livestock with them also makes clear that they will not be a drain on Egyptian resources. So it's like, hey, we have all of our animals and stuff. We don't need to take, like welfare. And I don't mean that bad, but I'm just saying they won't need welfare from the state. The plan succeeds and they are set up in the land of Goshen, right? So that's the point of all of that, is to get Jacob's family, Israel, in a good place. They're off by themselves. They're kind of separated from the Egyptians' mainland or main area. So there you have it. All right, Jacob adopts Ephraim and Manasseh. Notice that the younger Ephraim is chosen over the older Manasseh, continuing the themes of the previous generations, with Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph being the younger and in the preferred place. They seem to replace Reuben and Simeon in the blessings, right? So at 1 Chronicles 5:1, it says, the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, for he was the firstborn, but because he defiled his father's couch, his birthright was given to the sons of Joseph, the son of Israel. so that he could not be enrolled as the oldest son. Note that Reuben slept with his father's concubine, Bilhah, back in Genesis 35:22, and it just passes through that, and he says, says that he slept with his father's concubine, Bilhah, and then it just moves on. And it's like Jacob was like, well, okay. Well, now we get some punishment, right? It's like you lose your position in the family. Similarly, Simeon is cursed by Jacob for his killing of Shechem and his people. Levi was also involved in that, and so it's possible that Levi also was disinherited for that. Okay. All right. We're all adults here, right? What does it mean to swear an oath by putting one's hand under the thigh of another, right? Note that this happens at Genesis 24:9 with Abraham, where Abraham says to his servant, he says, hey, swear to me an oath that you will not get my son, a wife from the Canaanites. And he swears, and he says, okay, well, put your hand under my thigh. And then it happens again with Jacob here at 47:29. Putting one's hand under the thigh seems to be a euphemism for the genitals, right? Or the area of the genitals. And so you're like, well, that seems crazy. That doesn't seem to have anything to do with that. And why in the world would you do that? Note that in both cases, the oath has to do with the family line, right? And so the genitals, of course, are going to be the source of the family line. And so that seems to be a deal. Note that also circumcision, which obviously deals with the genitals, is a sign of the covenant with God. And so it would be like swearing an oath on the covenant of God that this thing will happen, right? That I will do this thing. And so it's the fact that it has to do with the family line, and then it's also is close to the area of the covenant, circumcision and all of that. Scholars will say that that's probably what that is. Otherwise, there is no example. There's no other example of that at all anywhere, right? And so, I've said it before. We can read ancient texts, and we can see all the many of these different customs and stuff. Because again, the Israelites, they lived in an area with cultures around them, and they did most of the things that those cultures did. But here, it's something that we can't find in any of those areas. All right, the blessings of Jacob's sons. Note that Reuben is cursed for sleeping with his father's concubine, again, at the blessing stage at the end. Simeon and Levi are cursed because of their rash behavior involving Shechem. Notice that when you get blessings from the father, like oftentimes they're curses, right? So blessings includes curses. And so you get Reuben is cursed, Simeon and Levi are cursed. Again, because of their involvement. Remember, Shechem's the one that rapes Dinah. And so, and then they go, remember, and they kill them all, like they kill everybody. And then they take their wives, right? They take all the women and basically enslave them. Judah is blessed with preeminence over his brothers. He is described as a lion and noted for the tribe's future role in the monarchy. Note that there is what we refer to as a textual difficulty in Genesis 49:10 concerning the word Shiloh. So you can look at that. I'd be interested to have you all turn in your Bibles to Genesis 49:10. It's concerning the word Shiloh, which is spelled differently than the place name. There's a place called Shiloh, but then there's this word here that's similar. So in the New American Standard Bible, it says at verse 10, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until Shiloh comes. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples." Well, what is Shiloh? Like, we don't know what Shiloh is, right? And so that word, we can't look at that word in other places because it's not spelled like the city. And even if it was, it makes no sense. Like it says Shiloh's coming, the city's coming. Like, no, that's not going to work. And so that's some confusion. The ESV says, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the people." So here we have people paying tribute to Judah, right? The NIV says, "The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his." And then the New Living Translation, of course, which is what we're reading through. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from his descendants, until the coming of the one to whom it belongs, which is similar to the NIV, the one whom all nations will honor. Now, the problem is, we don't know exactly what the translation is. The way that you get all of those different translations, like oftentimes, you'll get people and they'll look and they'll have their favorite translation, and they'll say, see, all these other translations, they corrupt what the Bible says, or they change the words in the Bible. That's not what it is. There is a legitimate issue in the Hebrew text that we can't translate it, right? We don't know how to translate. So Bible scholars will do the best they can. And the reason that they do it that way is you have this word that looks like Shiloh, and it has a different ending than the place, but the NASB people said, you know what? We're just going to put it in there. The word is Shiloh spelled, and so then when they put it into English, it looks like the place name. So they're just going to put that in there and say, okay, well, you figure it out, right? Which is a valid way to do it. That's the word, so we're going to put it there, and then who knows exactly what it means. The other translations, they will take words that look like those words that may have gotten put together at some point in time. Letters might have gotten changed at some point in time, and they'll figure out the most possible or likely scenarios, and then they'll use those translations. I assume that all of your Bibles who have different translations, you probably have a footnote at the bottom that says Shiloh or something like that. But that is a legitimate textual difficulty, and it's just that's the translators are trying to work it out as best they can, and that's why you have different translations. It's not a conspiracy to change the Bible. It is simply issues in the text. As James McCown points out, though, regardless of how it is translated, the point is that in spite of these difficulties, well, I'm reading his quote. In spite of these difficulties, it is clear that the passage indicates that the dominance of the tribe of Judah will not be lost until the coming of a person or an event that will firmly establish it, right? And so this certainly may have a fulfillment closer to their time period, their time period would be 800 years later with David. But then, of course, as Christians, we would see that ultimate fulfillment in the ultimate Davidic king in Jesus, right? And so, all right. The last major point that we'll go through, and then we'll read kind of the point of kind of what this section tells us. Embalming, right? So note that Jacob and Joseph are embalmed, right? Nobody else is embalmed. Israelites do not embalm people, but Egyptians do. Embalming in Genesis 50, 1 through 13. Notice it was practiced in Egypt, but not in Israel. So what does that entail? So the body was first washed with spices and water. The organs were removed. We've talked about this before. The important organs were put in containers. The brain, they did not think that the brain had any importance, so they would take a hook and they would pull it out through the nose, piece by piece. That's a great deal. The body would then be dried out with salt and other elements for 40 days. The organs would then either be placed back into the body, or they would be kept in the jars nearby the body when it was interned. This preserved, in Egyptian mythology, this preserved the body for the afterlife, right? So, because you needed that body. You were going to need it when you got. That's why they also killed off officials and stuff that worked for the Pharaoh. You would be killed too. So if the Pharaoh died, it's like, hey buddy, you're going to go with him into the afterlife and help him out, right? So you work for him here and there. And so they would kill you and you would go with him and you would be interned with him. The embalming of Jacob and Joseph, however, would preserve their bodies until they could be buried in the promised land, right? And so again, that's not because some weird thing that they thought. It's because they wanted to get the body back. And listen, Joseph's been there a long time. He's like, you know what? This embalming thing works pretty well. Like, it keeps the body around for a long time, so we'll do that. So the key passage to understanding Joseph's story, right? So if I had to say, all right, this is what you need to know about Joseph's story, is from his own words at Genesis 50, 19 through 21, where he's answering his brothers who think that he's going to kill them. It says, but Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. And note just a quick bit of theology for you. So what does that mean? And it's a theological issue. Does that mean that God caused all of these terrible things to happen to Joseph? No, not necessarily. What it means is that God used sinful people who were inclined to do sinful things. He used their sins ultimately for good. And God does this throughout the Bible, right? Judas in the New Testament, he is a perfect example. Judas is responsible for betraying Jesus. I know it says that Satan entered into him, but there's a lot of different, interpretations of what that exactly means. But it does not mean that Judas was just a good old guy and then suddenly Satan possessed his body and forced him against his will to do something evil, right? He clearly wanted to do that for whatever reason. And so God allows that to happen, and then it works out for good in the end. The Assyrians and the Babylonians who punish God's people, he does not send them in terms of Nebuchadnezzar is just sitting around watching Netflix and eating popcorn, and then God's like, hey, you're going to go kill off a bunch of people. And he's like, well, okay. I don't want to do that. But he uses Nebuchadnezzar to punish his people, right? And so God uses evildoers for his will, but he does not do evil things, and he does not put people to evil tasks. So that is a major point that you need to make sure that you do understand. All right, so listen, very quickly. Next week, we will start Job, which I know you've been reading this week. We're going to do it a little differently because Job is so repetitive and it all means basically the same stuff. What we're going to do next week is we are going to focus first on the genre of Job. We'll go into that a little bit, like how should we read Job, right? The divine counsel, which is right there in chapters 1 and 2, who are these sons of God and what does that mean and why is the Satan there? And then we're going to talk about Satan, and we're going to basically go through the entire Bible and talk about all the different places where Satan, and we're going to look at how they would have seen Satan in the Old Testament, which is going to be a little different than kind of the way we think about it. Now, the New Testament, that's where you get Satan, really fleshed out. But in the Old Testament, if you only had the Old Testament, you would actually, strangely enough, you would look at Satan a little differently. So we will go over all of that. Spoiler alert on that deal. But maybe that'll get you ready for next week, right? Thanks for watching, and please feel free to leave a comment or question. And if you found this video helpful, hit like. And if you would like to be notified when new videos are released, hit subscribe and join us next time as we study the Bible in context.